When the Canadian government issued a mandate that those regularly crossing the border with the United States must be vaccinated against COVID-19, it sparked huge protests from truck drivers. Lorries blockaded parts of the capital, Ottawa, as well as some of the border crossings. And in response, the federal Premier, Justin Trudeau, invoked the Emergencies Act, which is legislation designed for major national emergencies to quash the demonstrations and to freeze the bank accounts of protesters. Last week, a judge at Canada's federal court found that that government action was unlawful. Josh Derhas works at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which took the legal action against Justin Trudeau.
This happened back in January 2022, and Canadian truckers had been through a lot during COVID-19, and they just learned that the Government of Canada intended to go ahead with a vaccine mandate, which would require them to be vaccinated to cross the Canada-US border. And this meant for the 15% of truckers who were not vaccinated at the time that they would either need to, give up their right to choose whether to be vaccinated or potentially lose their livelihood. So they started this convoy protest where big rig trucks from across the country started heading toward Ottawa. And the plan was to converge on Ottawa for a protest outside of Parliament. And they gained a lot of support along the way. Canadians turned out to the sides of streets and to bridges and overpasses with their maple leafs to cheer on the truckers. And when they got to Ottawa, their plan, well, they didn't really seem to have a plan, but they said they were not leaving until these mandates were gone. And so they arrived in late January, and they parked their big trucks downtown in Ottawa. It's a really small city, and so this was pretty disruptive to the people who live downtown. They honked their horns. They basically had a big street party with, bouncy castles and hot tubs, and it was pretty disruptive to the people of Ottawa. But the more serious issue was there were some border blockades in other parts of the country that were sort of spawned by this protest, and those were being dealt with under normal sort of criminal code powers, policing powers, but the situation in Ottawa was continuing. And so Justin Trudeau decided that the solution, rather than waiting for the police to kick in and do their job and remove the protesters, that he was going to create some new laws that were only available to him through this Emergency Act, which is an extraordinary act meant for, wars and pandemics, a sort of act of last resort. Justin Trudeau used this act to do two things primarily. One was he essentially made it illegal to attend or assist a trucker protest. And the second thing that they did was freezing of bank accounts. So the law basically said that anyone who's a designated person, and a designated person was someone who's assisting with or participating in these protests, could have their bank accounts frozen. And what ended up happening was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police basically just made a list of people, gave it to the banks, and they had their checking accounts, their credit cards, their cryptocurrencies, all their assets frozen without any due process, without a warrant. Just suddenly you're sort of locked out of all of your accounts. We launched this action just over a week after invocation, and that's because we didn't know, how long this was going to be in place, and we thought these are some of the most serious violations of people's rights, the right to freedom of expression and the right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures that we had ever seen. This was a really extraordinary measure, and we wanted to fight back right away, so we got into gear really, really quickly. The government put forward several arguments, and they actually wrote this down in their declaration. And one of the arguments they made was that there was a threat to the security of Canada, and that simply was not true. The judge who looked at this said, threats to the security of Canada is defined in the legislation means serious harm against persons or property with an ideological, political, or religious aim, and that simply wasn't what was happening here. This was a nonviolent protest. It wasn't as if these people had guns. There was no arrests for any violence. This was extremely peaceful, except for maybe horn honking and a bit of blockading of the streets. But they also said that this was justified because of the economic harm. And they said, the economy is recovering from COVID, and this is preventing some trade from getting across the Canada-US border, which was no longer true by the time these measures came into place. And they also cited things like social cohesion and our relationship with the United States. And those types of things are not justification that's available to them for invoking this extraordinary legislation. This particular government, the Trudeau government, they had actually run an entire election in 2021 on whether we should have extremely harsh vaccine mandates and lockdown measures. And so their whole brand is sort of tied up in the idea of, getting back at the minority who chose not to get vaccinated and sort of scapegoating them for all of the problems that occurred during the COVID-19 crisis. So they sort of felt that they had to respond to this group that was very opposed to them. And if it had been another protest, like an Indigenous protest or a Black Lives Matter protest, I really doubt that they would have used such extreme measures. And we had smaller but quite serious Indigenous protests where, for example, rail lines were blocked, and that meant a lot of trade couldn't happen for a long period of time right before COVID. And we saw very little response, very little reaction from the federal government. So it really did seem that this was, this response was because of who was protesting against them.